Someone dumped a mountain of broken concrete and rebar right in front of my ranch gate. Like the HOA ordered a driveway makeover from a demolition crew with no return policy. And just to make sure I knew who to thank, they stuck a sign on it. Surprise improvement, improved piece of pine rock. HOA! I stood there, wondering if this was a prank, a threat, or a very aggressive landscaping suggestion. Ever had your home improved without asking? Just drop where you're watching from. I need to know if this kind of suburban circus is happening everywhere, or if I'm just the unlucky clown of the week. Walking out to check on my chickens at 5:30 that morning, I discovered this monument to passive aggression, sitting right where my driveway met the main entrance. Twisted rebar stuck up like metal fingers. A middle finger from the HOA. My feed truck couldn't get through to the livestock, which meant my animals were going hungry while I dealt with whatever game Celeste was playing. The mocking sign, attached to a metal post, read, "Upgrading Rural Eyes," in bold letters, like some kind of twisted public service announcement. I've been a farm equipment mechanic since I was 15 years old, working out of the barn workshop that my grandfather built with his own hands. And I've seen plenty of petty neighbor disputes. But this was something else entirely. I live alone on this property, keeping my life simple, with black coffee, eggs from my own chickens, and country music on an old radio that's been crackling the same static for 20 years. I don't look for trouble, mind my own business, and help neighbors when they need equipment fixed or a hand with heavy lifting. The idea that someone would deliberately sabotage my property while I slept felt like a violation of everything decent about rural community life. But I kept my cool and decided to handle this like a civilized person, at least at first. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the HOA contact information that had mysteriously appeared in my mailbox a few weeks earlier. "Ma'am," I said when Celeste Monroe answered, with a crisp, businesslike tone that immediately put me on edge. "There's a pile of concrete debris in my yard." Her response came without a pause, cold and matter-of-fact. "That's construction material to improve the mess you call a landscape." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. "What gives you the right to dump materials on my private property?" Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your lifestyle is incompatible with modern community standards." The way she said it made my blood pressure spike, like I was some kind of embarrassment that needed correction. Something about her tone and the formal way she referenced HOA authority didn't sit right with me. As far as I knew, my ranch had never been part of any homeowners association. My grandfather bought this land fair and square in 1962, and I had the original deed to prove it. After hanging up on Celeste, I went inside and started digging through the old filing cabinet, where I kept all the important papers. That's when I found the original property documents and spread them out on my kitchen table, tracing the boundary lines with my finger. A detail jumped out at me that made my heart skip a beat. The road that Celeste had just driven home on, the only road leading into the HOA development, ran straight through 200 feet of my property. My grandfather had allowed the community to use that access road as a courtesy, to be neighborly, but there was no legal document granting permanent rights to that passage. Looking out my window at the quiet road where Celeste had just disappeared in her luxury sedan, an idea about concrete barriers began forming in my mind with crystal clarity. If she wanted to play games with concrete, I was about to show her who the real expert was. The woman had just picked a fight with someone who understood both property law and heavy machinery, a combination that was about to make her life very interesting. The next morning, I spread out every document related to my property across the kitchen table, like I was planning a military campaign. The original deed from 1962 told a clear story. My grandfather owned this land outright, including the strip where the current road ran through to access the HOA development. Using the old measuring tape my grandfather used for surveying, I traced every boundary line until the truth was undeniable. There was no mention of any permanent right-of-ways, no easement, just a handshake agreement between neighbors that had lasted for 30 years. I traced the property lines with a red pen, circling the critical 200-foot section that gave the entire Pine Rock community access to their homes. Without that strip of road, they'd have to drive 4 miles around the county road to reach their driveways, assuming there even was another way in. Mavis Loudermilk knocked on my door around 10 size with a pot of coffee and the kind of determined expression that meant she had information to share. Mavis had been farming the land next to mine since before I was born, and she'd watched this whole HOA situation develop with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen plenty of troublemakers come and go. That woman has been nothing but problems since the day she moved in 8 months ago, Mavis said, settling into my kitchen chair like she was preparing for a long conversation. She's already pressured 3 families into selling their places, calling us all backward locals when she thinks nobody's listening. Mavis paused to sip her coffee and fix me with a meaningful look. That road's been there for 30 years, Austin. But your granddaddy never signed any official papers giving them permanent rights to use it. Later that afternoon, a courier delivered an official-looking document with notice of violation, printed in bold letters across the top. Celeste had compiled a detailed list of my supposed infractions. Unauthorized structures, like my chicken coop, noise pollution from my rooster, agricultural odors that were apparently offensive to delicate suburban sensibilities, and something called visual blight that seemed to encompass my entire way of life. At the bottom, in letters that practically screamed from the page, was a demand for a compliance fee of $12,000 to cover immediate property remediation. The document concluded with a threat that legal action would follow if I didn't comply within 72 hours. A quick internet search revealed the simple truth. Private roads crossing private property give the landowner complete control over access. Any invitation to use that road could be withdrawn at any time, especially when there was no formal legal agreement in place. The more I read, the more I realized that I held all the cards in this situation, even though Celeste was acting like she had the upper hand. My grandfather's neighborly gesture had created a situation where an entire community depended on my goodwill to reach their homes, and that goodwill was rapidly evaporating. Around 4 hours, I heard a car door slam outside and looked through my window to see Celeste Monroe marching toward my front door with a clipboard in one hand and a camera in the other. She was dressed like she was heading to a business meeting rather than walking through a working farm, with pristine white shoes that were about to meet some very real farm dirt. When I opened the door, she immediately started photographing my property without permission, documenting what she called violations, while muttering into a small recording device. "Ma'am," I said in my most polite voice, "you're on private property without permission." She barely looked up from her clipboard. I have HOA authority to inspect properties that aren't in compliance with community standards." I crossed my arms and leaned against my doorframe. "Show me the paperwork that proves I'm part of your HOA." For the first time since I'd encountered Celeste Monroe, she seemed genuinely flustered. She shuffled through her papers, stammering something about county planning approval and boundary expansions, but she couldn't produce a single document that included my property in the HOA jurisdiction. "The expansion was approved by county planning," she said, but her voice lacked the confident authority she'd displayed before. "I never received any notice about boundary changes," I replied, watching her confidence crumble in real time. She retreated toward her car with a threat that sounded more desperate than intimidating. "You'll regret this obstinate behavior, Mr. McCrae." After she left, I sat on my porch and connected the dots that had been forming since our first phone conversation. Celeste had somehow expanded the HOA boundaries to include my property without any legal authority to do so. She'd probably forged documents or manipulated the system to create the appearance of legitimate oversight where none existed. The woman was running a con game, using fake authority to pressure property owners into compliance with standards they'd never agreed to follow. But she'd picked the wrong target this time. I picked up my phone and called Big Mike's Construction, a local outfit that handled everything from fence posts to major building projects. "I need 8 concrete road barriers," I told Mike, "the heavy-duty kind, about 4 feet high and built to last." When he asked what they were for, I couldn't help but smile. "Traffic control on private property, Mike. I've got a situation that requires some serious traffic management." 2 tons each, Mike told me. "And they deliver them bright and early Friday morning." Celeste Monroe wanted to play power games with fake authority and manufactured violations, but she was about to learn that real property rights trump imaginary HOA powers every single time. Wednesday morning, I finalized the placement strategy for my concrete barriers, making sure I knew exactly where my land ended and the county road began. The barriers would need to be positioned with surgical precision, close enough to the road to completely block vehicle access, but clearly on my side of the property line to avoid any legal complications. I planned to space them 3 feet apart, just wide enough for a person to walk through, but impossible for any vehicle larger than a bicycle to pass. It was a calculated strike, designed to solve my HOA problem without creating new legal troubles for myself. Celeste wasn't sitting idle while I planned my counterattack. A second notice arrived Wednesday afternoon. This one labeled, "Final Warning, Legal Action Imminent," in red letters that looked like they were trying to jump off the page and slap me. She'd escalated her harassment campaign by taking photographs of my property and posting them online with captions like, "This eyesore affects all our property values," and "One bad neighbor ruins it for everyone." The comments from HOA members were predictably harsh. Words like disgusting, unacceptable, and property values dropping appeared repeatedly. It was clear that Celeste had rallied her supporters into a frenzy of indignation over my perfectly legal farm operation. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Deputy Norris, who pulled up in his patrol car and knocked on my door with the relaxed demeanor of someone conducting a routine check rather than investigating a serious complaint. "Someone called in a building code violation," he explained, "so I have to take a look around. But this seems pretty routine." I offered him coffee and gave him a complete tour of my property, showing him every permit, license, and inspection certificate I'd accumulated over the years. "No violations here, Mr. McCrae," he confirmed after examining my paperwork. "Everything looks completely legal and properly maintained." When I mentioned the road situation and Celeste's claims about HOA authority, Deputy Norris nodded knowingly. "It's your land, your right to control access. Just keep everything civil and document any harassment attempts." Mavis stopped by Thursday evening with fresh intelligence from her network of farming neighbors. "Half the HOA is getting tired of Celeste's drama," she reported, while we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "She's been trying to force out anyone who doesn't meet her definition of upscale enough for the community." Then Mavis dropped the bombshell that explained everything. That piece of information clicked several puzzle pieces into place. Celeste wasn't just a control freak neighbor. She was a desperate woman trying to rebuild her reputation and bank account by manipulating property values through intimidation and manufactured authority. As Thursday turned into evening, I wrestled with the moral implications of what I was planning. Part of me wanted to find a peaceful solution that would let everyone save face and move on with their lives. I remembered my grandfather's advice about being a good neighbor and keeping the peace whenever possible. But another part of me recognized that giving in to Celeste's demands would only encourage her to target the next property owner who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. Sometimes standing up to a bully requires more than words and good intentions. Sometimes it requires concrete action that creates real consequences. Celeste made one last desperate move Thursday night, hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on my background and filing an anonymous complaint with the Occupational Safety Agency about unsafe agricultural practices on my property. She even attempted to bribe the postal worker to intercept my mail, probably hoping to discover some financial vulnerability she could exploit. But 34 years of living honestly in a small community had left me with a reputation that couldn't be damaged by desperate smear tactics. My neighbors knew who I was and what I stood for, and no amount of manufactured controversy was going to change that. Big Mike called Thursday night to confirm delivery details. 8 Jersey barriers would arrive at 7 sharp Friday morning, along with a crane operator who could place them exactly where I wanted them. I spent Thursday night sketching the placement pattern on graph paper, making sure each barrier would be positioned for maximum effect while staying clearly within my property boundaries. When I called Mavis to give her a heads up about possible road changes starting Friday, she chuckled like a grandmother, watching her grandson outsmart the school bully. "Tell everyone that if they need emergency access, they can call me directly," I added. "I'm not trying to hurt innocent people, just solve a specific problem with a specific person." Thursday night, Celeste made one final phone call that confirmed she had no idea what was coming. "McCrae," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "I know you're planning something. Whatever it is, I'll crush you in court and make sure you lose everything." I took a sip of my beer and looked out at the quiet road that would be permanently changed in less than 12 hours. "Ma'am," I replied calmly. Tomorrow, you're going to learn about property rights in a very hands-on way. She hung up without another word, completely unaware that 4 tons of concrete barriers were already loaded on a truck and heading toward Pine Rock Valley. Friday morning at 7 sharp, Big Mike's construction truck rumbled up my driveway with 8 concrete Jersey barriers loaded on a flatbed trailer and a crane operator ready to place them with surgical precision. I directed the operation like a military commander positioning artillery, making sure each 2-ton barrier would land exactly where it needed to create an impenetrable wall across the road access. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect weather for what I privately called the Great Wall of McCrae construction project. Each barrier measured 4 feet high and 8 feet long, designed to stop vehicles while allowing pedestrians to squeeze through the 3-foot gaps between them. The installation process was methodical and oddly satisfying. Barrier number 1 landed with a solid thunk exactly on my property line, blocking the path any car would take to enter the HOA development. Barriers 2 through 7 followed in perfect formation, creating a concrete fence that looked both official and permanent. Barrier number 8 completed the wall, sealing the fate of anyone who depended on this road for convenient access to their home. The construction workers were impressed by the precision of my planning. They'd never seen someone put so much thought into barrier placement for what they assumed was a simple traffic control project. Mavis positioned herself on her front porch with a cup of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone about to witness long overdue justice. One of the younger neighbors had his phone out, recording everything for what would probably become the most viral video Pine Rock Valley had ever produced. When curious neighbors asked what I was doing, I maintained a calm, professional demeanor. Just improving security measures on private property. Nothing more complicated than that. The crane operator finished his work by 10:15, leaving me standing behind my newly constructed concrete fortress with a profound sense of accomplishment and anticipation. At 10:30, Celeste Monroe returned from her weekly grocery shopping trip and stopped her car dead in the middle of the road when she saw my concrete barrier installation. I watched from my kitchen window as the reality of her situation sank in. There was no way around the barriers, no alternate route to her house, and nowhere to turn her car around on the narrow road. She sat in her driver's seat for nearly 5 minutes, groceries slowly warming in her back seat, staring at the barriers like they might disappear if she wished hard enough. Finally, she got out of her car. Her pristine white outfit and designer shoes looked ridiculous against the backdrop of my working farm. "What the hell is this?" she screamed, her voice carrying across the valley like a siren announcing the end of her reign of terror. I stepped onto my porch with my coffee cup, maintaining the calm demeanor of someone who'd been expecting this exact reaction. "Traffic control devices, ma'am. Standard concrete barriers for managing vehicle access on private property." Her face turned red as she processed the implications of what I'd done. In her rage, she kicked at the nearest barrier with her expensive shoe, immediately slipping on the smooth concrete surface and falling backward, her white pants now decorated with farm dirt. Then came the beautiful meltdown. "These barriers are on my property," I replied evenly. "So I can place whatever security measures I deem necessary to protect my land and control access through it." Celeste's desperation was spectacular, and exactly what I'd hoped for. She tried to physically push the barriers, apparently forgetting that each one weighed 2 tons and had been designed to stop vehicles traveling at highway speeds. When brute force failed, she called the police on her cell phone, screaming into the device, "I want this man arrested immediately. I'll sue him in court. Call the media. Take this to the state level." Her voice carried across the area as she paced around her stranded car like a caged animal, while other HOA residents began arriving to find their usual route home completely blocked. By now, a small crowd had gathered to witness the spectacle. "Finally, someone taught her a lesson," muttered one elderly man I'd never met before. A woman with her arms crossed added, "She made me tear down my daughter's rabbit hutch because she said it violated community standards." The backup of confused drivers created exactly the kind of public spectacle that would make Celeste's situation impossible to ignore or downplay. Deputy Norris arrived within 20 minutes and assessed the situation with the methodical approach of someone who'd seen plenty of neighbor disputes escalate into public drama. He checked my property boundaries using the survey documents I'd prepared, confirmed that every barrier was positioned on my side of the property line, and listened patiently while Celeste demanded that he arrest me for obstructing public access. "Ma'am," Deputy Norris explained with professional patience, "these barriers are on private property. Mr. McCrae has every legal right to control vehicle access through his land." When Celeste sputtered about established roads and community access, the deputy calmly explained that private roads through private property don't create automatic public rights of way. The education moment that followed was deeply satisfying for me and devastating for Celeste's sense of authority. I explained to the growing crowd of onlookers that the road had always crossed my property, that my grandfather had allowed access as a neighborly courtesy, and that no legal document had ever granted permanent access rights to the community. An invitation to use private property can be withdrawn at any time, Deputy Norris confirmed, especially when there's no formal agreement in place. The crowd's reaction was mixed. About half were angry about the inconvenience, while the other half admitted that Celeste had brought this situation on herself through her aggressive tactics and harassment campaign. Standing behind my barriers, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction wash over me. Each 2-ton monument represented my refusal to be bullied, intimidated, or forced off land that had been in my family for generations. The practical impact of my barrier installation was immediate and comprehensive. HOA residents would now have to drive 4 miles around the county road system to reach their homes, turning a 2-minute commute into a 20-minute journey. Delivery trucks, mail carriers, and service providers were confused and frustrated by the sudden road closure. Celeste's house was effectively landlocked, accessible only by the long route that added significant time and cost to every trip. The abstract conflict over property rights and community standards had suddenly become a concrete reality that affected everyone's daily routine. As Celeste finally drove away, her face red with humiliation and rage, I noticed something interesting in her rearview mirror that made everything click into place. Her license plate frame read Monroe and Associates Realty in elegant script letters. Suddenly, her aggressive tactics and desperate need to control property standards made perfect sense. She wasn't just a random control freak with too much time on her hands. She was a real estate professional with a financial agenda, someone who stood to profit from forcing property improvements and sales in the area. I just destroyed her business plan with 8 concrete barriers and a better understanding of property law than she'd expected from a backward local. Celeste's response to my barrier installation was swift and expensive. She hired a real estate attorney from the city who filed an emergency motion demanding immediate removal of what he called illegal obstructions of an established public right-of-way. The legal paperwork was impressive, full of technical language about easements and community access rights, but it was built on a foundation of lies and assumptions that wouldn't survive contact with the actual property records. Local media picked up the story, with headlines like "Rural Property Owner Blocks Entire Community," that made me sound like either a hero or a villain, depending on which angle the reporter wanted to emphasize. I had to admit there was something darkly amusing about being called a villain for exercising basic property rights that any suburban homeowner would take for granted. The legal challenge motivated me to dig deeper into county records, and what I discovered with Mavis's help was even worse than I'd suspected. A coffee-fueled afternoon at the county courthouse, with Mavis serving as my research assistant and occasional voice of outrage, revealed that Celeste had submitted forged HOA expansion documents to the county planning office. The paperwork included fake signatures and backdated documents that claimed to include my property in the association's jurisdiction, but the forgeries were sloppy enough that even Mavis could spot the inconsistencies. The original HOA charter clearly showed boundaries that stopped well short of my ranch, but Celeste's amended charter had mysteriously expanded those boundaries to encompass several rural properties, including mine. When I called the county clerk to verify the filing, she confirmed that the documents had never been properly submitted or legally approved. They were sitting in a pending file, waiting for verification that would never come. Armed with evidence of Celeste's forgery, I decided to crash the emergency HOA meeting she'd called to discuss dealing with the obstructionist neighbor who's holding our community hostage. The meeting was held in the community center of the HOA development, a bland building that looked like every suburban meeting room in America. About 30 residents packed into folding chairs, their faces showing various degrees of anger, frustration, and curiosity about what their HOA president had gotten them into. When I walked through the door carrying a folder full of documents, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to me like I was some kind of unwelcome celebrity. "Who the hell are you to just walk in here?" demanded one red-faced man, who'd clearly been building up steam before my arrival. Several other residents murmured agreement, their hostility palpable in the cramped room. I set my folder on the front table and looked around at faces that ranged from suspicious to openly hostile. "I'm Austin McCrae," I said calmly, "and I'm not a member of your HOA. But then again, neither are any of you." The room erupted in confused chatter as people tried to process what I just said. Celeste, who'd been standing at the front with her presentation materials, went pale as she realized what was coming. "Before we talk about obstructionist neighbors," I announced, spreading the original and forged documents across the front table, "let's talk about forgery and fraud." The moment of truth was beautifully simple. The silence that followed was deafening as residents leaned forward to examine the documents, their anger slowly shifting from me to the woman who'd been collecting their money under false pretenses. A middle-aged woman near the front stood up, her voice shaking with rage. "I've paid almost $6,000 in fees over the past year. What did you do with our money?" Another resident pulled out his phone and started live streaming. "People need to know this isn't a real HOA." The crowd's mood shifted from confusion to fury as the implications sank in. Celeste had been running a sophisticated con game, using fake authority to extract money and compliance from people who'd trusted her to act in their best interests. Celeste tried to mount a desperate defense, her voice cracking under pressure. "I was only doing what was best for the community. Property values needed protection. Standards needed to be maintained." She was immediately cut off by angry voices from the crowd. "You forged documents. You threatened to force people to sell their land. You harassed elderly neighbors. What's good about any of that?" The revelation of her background added another layer of scandal to an already explosive situation. Mavis had spent hours researching newspaper archives and discovered articles about Celeste Monroe losing her real estate license after a fraud conviction in her previous state. She'd lost everything in a scandal involving forged documents and unauthorized property sales, then moved to Pine Rock Valley looking for a fresh start and easy targets for her next scheme. The room divided into factions as the full scope of Celeste's deception became clear. Those who'd supported her harassment campaigns against rural neighbors sat silently, unable to meet anyone's eyes. A young couple near the back whispered to each other, "Are we really living in some kind of fantasy? Did we actually believe all this?" The community that Celeste had tried to control through fear and manufactured authority was fracturing along lines of guilt, anger, and disbelief. As the meeting devolved into chaos, someone suggested forming a legitimate community organization to replace the fake HOA structure. Several residents turned to me, assuming I'd want to lead this new effort. "You should organize the real community," one woman suggested. "You're the one who exposed all this." I shook my head firmly. I'm not cut out to be anyone's boss. I just want to be left alone on my land. But if someone else tries to pull this kind of scam again, I'll be back to shut it down. The message was clear. I wasn't interested in power or control, just in protecting my rights and helping others protect theirs, despite pressure from neighbors who wanted me to remove the barriers and end the drama. I remained firm in my position that giving in to criminal behavior would only encourage more of it. Removing those barriers rewards everything she's done wrong. I explained to anyone who would listen. Principles matter more than convenience, and if we don't stand up to bullies when we have the chance, they just find new victims to target. My stance wasn't popular with everyone, but it was consistent with the values my grandfather had taught me about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The breaking point came when Celeste showed up at my property late one evening, not screaming or threatening this time, but quietly desperate in a way that was almost pitiful. "Austin," she said, using my first name for the first time, "name your price for easement rights. I'll buy a permanent right-of-way through your property, and we can both put this behind us." She even offered to purchase the entire strip of land that the road crossed, throwing around dollar amounts that suggested she had more money hidden away than her bankruptcy filings indicated. I looked at the woman who'd called my lifestyle an embarrassment and my heritage backward, and I realized that some things really aren't for sale. "Ma'am," I replied, maintaining the same polite tone I'd used since this whole mess started. "Some things aren't for sale. Respect is one of them, and dignity is another. You can't buy your way out of the consequences of treating people like garbage." The next morning, I found Celeste standing by my barriers, not trying to move them or damage them, just staring at them like monuments to her own failure. Mavis walked by and observed that Celeste had finally realized the game was over. But I knew that wounded animals could be the most dangerous. Celeste Monroe wasn't finished yet, and her final desperate act was still waiting in the wings. The world that Celeste Monroe had built on lies and intimidation collapsed with remarkable speed once the truth came to light. Federal investigators filed mail fraud charges related to her forged documents, while state authorities opened an investigation into her real estate fraud activities. The fake HOA dissolved immediately once its illegal status was exposed, and property values in the area actually increased without the artificial restrictions and harassment that had been driving away potential buyers. Several families who'd been considering selling their homes because of Celeste's pressure campaign decided to stay and invest in improvements instead. A genuine community meeting was organized to discuss how residents could move forward without the fake HOA structure that had caused so much trouble. The atmosphere was completely different from Celeste's authoritarian gatherings. People spoke freely, listened to different perspectives, and worked towards solutions that respected everyone's rights and interests. I attended the meeting and proposed a reasonable compromise. I would install a simple gate system that residents could access with a code, and they would pay a modest monthly fee to cover road maintenance costs. No harassment, no manufactured violations, just a straightforward business arrangement between neighbors. The legal noose continued tightening around Celeste's neck as investigators uncovered the full scope of her fraudulent activities. Multiple criminal charges were pending, her assets were frozen to prevent her from fleeing the jurisdiction, and she was forced to put her house on the market to pay for legal expenses. Her desperate attempts to avoid jail time included offering to cooperate with investigations into other real estate fraud schemes. But prosecutors weren't interested in deals with someone who'd built her entire local presence on forged documents and intimidation tactics. The woman who'd once projected such confidence and authority was clearly unraveling under the pressure of her collapsing schemes. There's something unsettling about watching someone's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time, even when that person thoroughly deserves whatever consequences they're facing. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But not quite enough to forget how she'd treated me and my neighbors during her reign of manufactured authority. Despite the mounting evidence of Celeste's criminal behavior, some neighbors continued pressuring me to remove the barriers and restore normal access to the community. Their arguments focused on convenience and the desire to move past the drama, but I remained convinced that giving in would send the wrong message about accountability and consequences. Taking down those barriers rewards everything she's done wrong, I explained during one heated discussion. Sometimes standing up for what's right requires accepting some inconvenience in the short term to prevent bigger problems in the long term. Celeste's final desperate act came on a Tuesday night when she attempted to burn my concrete barriers using gasoline and matches, apparently believing that fire could somehow destroy structures designed to withstand vehicle impacts at highway speeds. My security cameras captured the entire incident, showing her pouring gasoline around the base of each barrier and lighting matches that created brief flames but no lasting damage. The concrete was completely unaffected by her arson attempt, but the video evidence added another serious felony charge to her growing legal troubles. The arrest scene was both dramatic and pathetic. Police arrived while Celeste was still at the scene, standing among the barriers with empty gasoline containers and the smell of burnt fuel hanging in the air. I watched from my kitchen window as she was handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car, her face a mixture of defiance and defeat that suggested she still couldn't quite believe how completely her schemes had backfired. The flashing lights reflected off my concrete barriers, creating an almost surreal tableau that perfectly captured the absurdity of someone trying to destroy evidence with fire while being filmed by security cameras. The legal resolution began moving quickly once Celeste's guilt became undeniable. Plea bargain negotiations started, with prosecutors demanding restitution for all the money she'd illegally collected, compensation for the property damage and harassment her campaign had caused, and a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with me or my property. Prison time seemed inevitable, given the multiple federal and state charges she was facing, but the exact sentence would depend on her cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar schemes in other communities. Media attention brought unexpected support from across the region, with other rural property owners sharing stories of similar harassment campaigns and expressing gratitude that someone had finally stood up to HOA overreach. Letters arrived from farmers, ranchers, and rural residents who'd faced pressure to sell their land or change their lifestyle to accommodate suburban sensibility. The story became a symbol of the tension between traditional rural life and expanding suburban development, with my concrete barriers representing the importance of standing firm against pressure to abandon your values and heritage. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening to my barriers themselves. Kids from neighboring properties had started leaving small flowers between the concrete sections, turning my defensive wall into an impromptu memorial to standing up for yourself. One morning, I found a handwritten note tucked into a gap. "Thank you for showing us that bullies don't always win. Sarah, age 12. The barriers were becoming something more than just traffic control. They were becoming a symbol that resonated with anyone who'd ever felt powerless against authority figures who abused their position. 6 months after that first pile of concrete debris appeared in my yard, my barriers still stood, like monuments to the importance of defending your rights against bullies and con artists. But their meaning had evolved from symbols of conflict to symbols of community strength and the power of standing up for what's right. Prison orange had not been a good color choice for Celeste Monroe, and her 18-month sentence served as a permanent reminder that actions built on lies and intimidation eventually crumble under the weight of truth and justice. 1 year after the concrete barriers first appeared, my life had returned to a peaceful routine, but the landscape of Pine Rock Valley had been permanently changed by our conflict. The gate system I'd installed was working perfectly, with residents using access codes to come and go while paying monthly fees that covered road maintenance and my time managing the system. Neighbors who had initially supported Celeste's harassment campaign became genuine allies once they understood what had really been happening, apologizing sincerely for believing her lies and participating in the pressure campaign she'd orchestrated. The community was stronger and more united than it had been under Celeste's authoritarian rule, with genuine democratic processes replacing the manufactured drama that had divided neighbors against each other. The transformation happened gradually and naturally as local children asked permission to paint murals on them, and I agreed enthusiastically, providing them with brushes and paint to create colorful designs that celebrated themes of unity, strength, and standing up for what's right. The murals attracted tourists who stopped to take photographs and ask about the story behind the barriers, turning my modest farm into an unexpected destination for people interested in grassroots resistance to corporate and bureaucratic overreach. The new family that moved into Celeste's former house brought fresh energy to the community and a commitment to healing the divisions her leadership had created. They visited me during their first week in the neighborhood, bringing homemade cookies and sincere apologies for the behavior of their predecessor. "We heard about what happened with the previous homeowner," the wife said, her husband nodding in agreement. "We want you to know that we're here to be good neighbors and contributors to the community, not troublemakers." Their children immediately gravitated toward the barrier murals, adding their own small contributions to the growing artwork that covered the concrete surfaces. The economic impact of resolving the HOA conflict was entirely positive for the area. Property values stabilized and actually increased once the artificial restrictions and harassment campaigns ended, proving that community cooperation works better than authoritarian control. Small businesses in Pine Rock Valley benefited from the curious visitors who came to see the famous barriers and learn about the story behind them. A local cafe even started serving a sandwich called the Concrete Special in honor of the barriers, though I remained somewhat uncomfortable with the commercialization of what had been a serious legal and personal conflict. The legal precedent established by my case had ripple effects throughout the region, with other rural property owners citing the McRae standard in their own disputes with aggressive HOAs and development companies. County officials became more careful about verifying the authenticity of documents submitted by HOAs, claiming expanded authority, and state legislators began discussions about strengthening protections for rural property owners facing pressure from suburban expansion. My simple act of defending my property rights had contributed to broader conversations about community values and individual liberty. The personal growth I experienced through this conflict surprised me with its depth and lasting impact. I learned that sometimes avoiding confrontation enables bad behavior, and that standing up for principles requires accepting short-term discomfort to achieve long-term justice. The confidence I gained from successfully defending my rights changed how I approached other challenges in my life, making me more willing to speak up when I witnessed injustice and more committed to helping others find their own strength when facing similar situations. The fate of Celeste Monroe served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of building your life on lies and intimidation. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of probation, during which she was prohibited from engaging in any real estate activities. Bankruptcy proceedings stripped away most of her remaining assets, and multiple civil lawsuits from her victims ensured that she would be paying restitution for years to come. She left Pine Rock Valley permanently, though rumors occasionally surfaced about her attempting similar schemes in other communities where her background wasn't known. Environmental changes around the barriers added natural beauty to what had started as purely functional structures. The barriers had become part of the natural environment, proof that even conflicts between humans could eventually contribute to something beautiful and harmonious. The symbolic meaning of my barriers evolved over time to represent broader themes of resistance to tyranny, the importance of knowing your rights, and the power of standing up to bullies, regardless of their claims to authority. School groups visited to learn about property law, community organizing, and the difference between legitimate authority and manufactured intimidation. Community integration reached its peak during the first annual Barrier Day celebration, where residents gathered to share food, music, and stories about overcoming challenges through cooperation and mutual support. I was reluctantly persuaded to give a short speech about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. Sometimes you have to build walls before you can build bridges, I told the crowd, gesturing toward the colorful murals that now covered my barriers. But the goal should always be bringing people together, not keeping them apart. Looking toward the future, I felt confident that Pine Rock Valley had learned valuable lessons about community leadership, individual rights, and the importance of treating neighbors with respect regardless of lifestyle differences. New developments were planned for the area, but they would be built with input from existing residents, rather than imposed by outside developers or aggressive HOAs. The most surprising development came when a documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to tell the story of the concrete cowboy for a national audience. I politely declined. Some stories are meant to stay local, and I'd never been comfortable with attention. But I did agree to let them film the barriers and interview neighbors about what the whole experience had taught them. Mavis, of course, was delighted to be on camera. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has the strongest backbone, she told the filmmaker. Austin just proved that David still beats Goliath when David knows his rights. The final twist came when I received a call from a lawyer representing 3 other rural communities facing similar HOA takeover attempts. They wanted to use my case as precedent to show that property owners don't have to surrender to fake authority just because it comes with official-looking paperwork. I found myself reluctantly becoming a consultant for people fighting their own concrete battles, though I always insisted my only expertise was knowing when to say no and meaning it. My story ends where it began, with concrete playing a central role in defining relationships and resolving conflicts. But instead of debris dumped in anger and spite, the concrete barriers stand as monuments to the possibility of transformation, the power of principled resistance, and the ultimate triumph of community cooperation over individual tyranny. Celeste Monroe learned about concrete consequences the hard way, discovering that actions built on lies and intimidation eventually crumble under the weight of truth and justice. Some lessons last forever, just like concrete, when it's properly placed and given time to set. Thanks for watching.